Well, friends, welcome to our webinar chat for Chapter 8 in my book, Think Like a Filmmaker, Sensory-Rich Worship Design for Unforgettable Messages. And this is a way of me coming on and just sort of digging deep into the chapter, giving you a little bit of personal attention in terms of just talking about what it was like to write the chapter, what's in the chapter, and some of the highlights. So that as you read the book, you can sort of use this as a way to create a curriculum, really. So, friends, if you have been following along, you know that we have been thinking like art directors and cinematographers and screenwriters and composers and directors. And today we're talking about Chapter 8, which has us thinking like an editor. Hello. One of the most important pieces of creating anything is getting to the point where you take all of the things that you have been dreaming about, thinking about, and you put them together. This is the rubber hits the road moment for the design process. Because we have gotten help from all of the worship team. They have dreamed up different ways that we could sing the message, ways that we could speak the message, ways that we hear the message, see the message, all of these things. And probably you have more ideas than you can use at this point. That's the beauty of a team. And that is that, many minds are much better than one because we can get to some really great ideas. And one of the things that we'll talk about next time in Chapter 9 is really about how do we continue to work as a team and understand that when we do, we're going to have more ideas than we can really use. And the team has to understand that and know that your contribution, if for some reason it ends up on the cutting room floor, which we're going to talk about today, if it falls on the cutting room floor, it doesn't mean that it wasn't valuable. In fact, it may have been the catalyst to the next idea, which is really what we end up using. And so all ideas in this process are really, really important. And just because something ends up on the cutting room floor does not mean that that was not a valuable contribution. So teams that are watching this, I want you to hear me on this. I have had so many ideas that never came to fruition, just simply because that's the way we get to the right thing or the next right thing. There's never just one way to do things. And so that's the beauty of creativity, is that when we put our minds together, we come up with lots of things so that then we can get to something that really will be the way that we will do it this time, right? I also encourage you, as you're designing, to keep track of those ideas that you don't use, because I have often had ideas that I was playing with for one series and I really fell in love with it, but it didn't quite work out, and have totally used that for a different series, and it turned out to be the perfect thing. So really important to sort of keep track of those good ideas that don't quite make it into the series. All right, so that's the heart of editing, right? So let's take a look at what the subheadings are in the chapter. We're going to go through each one today, and I'm just going to give you little nuggets about each one. The cutting room floor, I've already started talking about that. We're going to talk about how editors talk about, their first run through, their first draft of editing. And that's what we have to do. We have to start putting these ideas together. And at first, I talk about it in the book like the metaphor of having a baby, because in my creative process, I always get to the point where I go, I want to take it back. I don't want to do this, right? Because it's like, I can't quite see it yet, but it's time to see it. And so I am always, there's a point at which, I just need to push through. And that's the labor part, right? You have to go through labor in order to have delivery of this thing. And when you get to production week, which is what we're going to talk about today is what I call production week, then you have to push through. And it's not always going to feel like, I know exactly what to do, because you're dealing with a lot of different ideas, and you have to find that way that's going to work. So the cutting room floor is one of our subheadings. The order of worship, the narrative flow. This is, as we start to put together the series, we need to pay attention to that sort of meta-narrative that is the structure in which we are creative. But also within that structure, how are we going to be unique for this series because of what the message is? And that's really what gives a series its flavor, is the way that we do certain things that we do all the time, but maybe we do them a little bit differently for this series. That's when the getting gets good, right? We're going to talk about layered sequences. I talked about layering before. The book talks about layering early on. This whole idea that we're not just doing one little art form at a time, that there are times when instead of just speaking and just singing, we're actually letting the two play together, and letting music and words play together. And certainly as you read the book, especially the chapters about words and about music for sure, you got that idea of what layering is. But as we start to put it together in production week, we begin to see now is where we really get the ideas about how the sequence is going to get layered with different art forms. And we put that in. And that's going to really come out in the script writing. Script writing is different than just filling in the blanks in a bulletin or what I call a worship guide. It's really about imagining, seeing what is happening in the space and describing that in what we call rubrics, which is the liturgical name for stage directions, right? And so in our scripts, as we create that first week of our series, we're going to imagine what's happening in the space and we're going to write that. And so that we can really, when we get to the cue to cue rehearsal, we can really try that out and see how that's working. So we're going to talk about scripts. I'm going to give you some nuts and bolts ideas about how I go about that. And then talk about, once you get the scripts done, the production. I mean, that can feel like a huge achievement, and it is. But if you stop there and then you sort of wait and carry out the tasks week to week, you can still feel stressed out. And that's, the basis of this book is how can we be creative? How can we create sensory-rich worship on a weekly basis without getting burned out? So we're going to, as soon as those scripts are done, we're going to push ourselves to get tasks done related to the entire series at once, right? So some things we can't do until the week of, but most of the things like scheduling readers and beginning to rehearse that music and getting the visuals, going shopping for whatever we need, that can all get done before the series begins for the entire thing. So task management, then we'll go into the weekly things. That is the cue to cue rehearsal. We'll talk a little bit about worship guides, and that's my word for bulletins, and about getting the word out. So I see already a question. This is awesome. Worship guides. We've gone to just giving out a list of calendar items, announcements, and prayer requests since everything is on the screen. The head usher, tech team, pianist, liturgist, pastor have full worship guides, or hopefully what you mean is scripts. Any comments on that? I will absolutely comment on that. And Nancy, in my book, in chapter 8, I really go into sort of detail about that. And for me, that is about, it's not either or, it's both and. So we'll talk about that when we get to worship guides. I think that even if you have everything on the screen, which is great, that there are some people for whom just knowing what's next is such a comfort. So we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. Okay, so let's get to the cutting room floor. So what you're seeing on the slide right now is a picture of some film editors, right? So as I began to talk to filmmakers and all different artists related to the filmmaking process, one of the things that that film editors say is that they have an oh yes and an oh no moment. The oh yes moment is in the dailies. Now dailies are after they shoot, let's say a day shoot, right? Then they're going to look at the dailies, look at what they've shot that day to make sure they've gotten what they need. And what editors say is that when they look at the dailies, they're like, oh yes, we have so much good material to work with. Right? And then when the shooting is finished and they hit the editing studio and they begin that first draft of editing, they have the oh no moment. And the oh no moment is, oh no, we have so much good stuff to work with. So, the blessing that they felt exhilarated about during the shooting now is like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get it all into a coherent whole? And they say that the first draft, the first, getting through the first run through of it, the first edit, it's still too long. It's still usually way too long. So they have to sort of do it in stages, right? They sort of put together the way they think, and then they realize, yeah, we can't have a 3-hour movie or a 4-hour movie. And then they began to have to really hone it. And I think this is really informative for us, for those of us who create worship, who design worship, because oftentimes we never get to the editing stage. I mean, it's all editing when we start to put it together. But sometimes it's really hard to let go of some of the good stuff. It really is. But here's the thing that editors say of film, and that is, if you have a film that has one amazing moment after another, but it's so long, it's unwatchable. You can't sustain that kind of thing. You have to have something that really works as a whole thing, not just a string of really great stuff. So maybe that's that saying, too much of a good thing is still too much, right? So we really have to get down to what is it that's going to be the kernel, the essence that's going to move that message, that story further, and will really bring it home and simplify. There's a point in my process, in every process of designing, where I get to the point and my mantra is simplify, simplify, simplify. And that is when I feel that feeling, I mean, it just pops into my head and I have to listen to that. Because what it means is that even as I imagine what this is going to be, sometimes it's in a cue to cue, right? I've designed the whole thing, I'm walking through it, and I go, oh my gosh, this is interminable. We can't do this. How do I simplify this? And I let something go. So listening to that little voice in my head that says simplify, simplify, simplify is a really important thing. And so things begin to fall on the cutting room floor. Now, how do we make those decisions? In the book, I talk about 3 different things that we have to sort of use to evaluate whether or not our scripts, our worship series, is a cohesive whole and is really going to work for us. And it's about balancing things. So the first one I talk about is a balance of repetition and innovation, right? All of us know, another way to say that is the familiar and the new. But I don't just mean the familiar and the new, because that's important to have some familiar elements in that, in your worship. But it's also those things that will repeat every Sunday, right, that give us the flavor. It's called our threads that we talked about in chapter 2. Our thread items. A song that repeats, or a prayer response that repeats, a visual that repeats. That can create a real sense of familiarity, even if those things are new the first week. And it's amazing. It only takes really one repetition, like by the second week and certainly by the third week. Those things feel familiar. Repetition is an amazing thing. Our brains love it. And so as soon as we see a pattern, we glom onto it, right? And then it feels like, yeah, okay, I've been here before. But if everything was repeated, then that would be monotonous, right? And it wouldn't move the story forward. In the music chapter, we talked about composers and how they use a theme, maybe melody, throughout the movie. And there's really great movies that use this technique. Almost every movie actually uses a theme melody. But if they repeated it the exact same way every time, with the same instrumentation, the same tempo, the same whatever, that would get monotonous and would distract us actually from the film. But what they do is they nuance it each time. And so then it provides this thread, but it also creates this continued interest and keeping us in the story. It serves whatever place in the story that we're at. And so that's this beautiful balance in a worship series. My philosophy is that series are a really good thing, and that within a series, what it enables us to do is to utilize some of these techniques that really work in storytelling. And that is those things that that repeat in order to sort of keep that storyline going, and those things that innovate, that are different every week, that help move the story forward or deeper, right? More likely it's deeper or in a different direction, a slightly different nuance for a worship series, because we're not creating a sequel, right? Every worship service stands on its own, right? You don't have to have been at the first one in order to enter the second one in order to enter the third one. But because we're repeating some things for those people who are able to come a couple weeks in a row, then that really creates this satisfaction. So then there's also the balance of theme-based material or not. So, when I'm designing a series, I will first look for, let's just use music, congregational song. I will first look for songs that really speak to the theme. And, I can find some themes, I can find hundreds of songs that speak to the theme, especially if it's something that's a classic symbol like water or bread or light that many, many composers have used as imagery in their poetry for their congregational song. And so I may have a list of 100 different songs about trees, if that's my anchor image. But if I put a song in every place about trees, that would be nauseating, right? Monotony comes in many forms, and that could get monotonous for us. And so sometimes we need to think about a broader kind of thing. How can we use something that is not perhaps just about this anchor image or this theme, but is more about what we're doing in the moment, right? Whether that be prayer or praise, lament, or what have you. So, that balance of theme-based material and not. So that's another way to evaluate the cohesion of the whole. Another one is the balance of dynamics, right? So what I mean by this is, we talked about it in a couple of the chapters, and that is, what's the energy, the spirit of the moment? And do we have peaks and valleys in that? Are we utilizing some time of perhaps deep contemplative time? But if we stay there the entire time, then, it's hard to, there's also that need to bring the energy up. So if we look at it from that standpoint, it's really important as well. Now, certain liturgical seasons are going to lend themselves to more of one kind of dynamic or another. For instance, Lent, you might spend more time in that contemplative kind of feel. In fact, your threshold moment, which is that beginning, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, that beginning of the service where we enter into the story, that's going to have a different flavor depending on the message, depending on the liturgical year, depending on, really what kind of season of our lives and the story of our faith that we're in. So the balance of dynamics. So these three things I describe in the book further, so you can read that in the book. But I wanted to bring that up because it's important to evaluate as we're putting these scripts together, putting the material together, and look at it in terms of these various things. All right, so the design process. In the first two chapters, I talked about the beginning of that process. In chapter 1, we talked about the visionary retreat. We talked about synopsis writing, right? So that was really the visionary or the pastor, the preacher, going off on retreat at least twice a year, doing some long-range planning so that our teams can begin to work with that in a timely manner, meaning ahead of time. So that was chapter 1. We really dug in deep with that. And then in chapter 2, we moved forward, and I sort of gave some broad brushstrokes about the entire process that I have here. But we spent more time in chapter 2 around the brainstorming and resource gathering processes, because that's when the team gets involved. And then the next chapters, of course, the next 5 chapters, I talked about each one of the ritual art forms to help folks with, how do I come up with ideas for this? What are the different possibilities? So hopefully reading all 5 of those chapters has helped you to learn more about what you can think of as you gather resources for that series, and sort of expanding the the range and the knowledge of your team around each one of those art forms. So now, as we get to chapter 8, this is the production continues. And, that word production, I talked about that in chapter 2. It's not a bad word. It doesn't mean, anytime we take a whole bunch of things and we put them together, we're producing something, right? We have an end result. We have something that we have to, Sunday comes around, like clockwork, it's going to be there. We have to have something ready. So we produce something. We take all of these different elements, we put them together. And so I'm using this language of production, the production week, which is 4 weeks before. So we're in the script writing phase there on the slide. So 4 weeks before, 1 month before the series begins, the rubber is going to hit the road, and we're going to take all of that brainstorming that we have done, all that resource gathering that our team has helped put together. And again, the number one rule for teamwork is that when there are no decisions to be made, there are more people involved. So that was the brainstorming and resource gathering process. We're gathering as many ideas as we can. No editor at that point, but now the editing happens. So the other part of that number one teamwork rule is that when there are decisions to be made, there are less people involved. And this is the moment, right? The script writing phase, this is the moment. Not everybody in the team is going to be involved in writing the scripts because this requires lots of decisions. And so you're going to want to have a core team working on this. It depends on your working process. Most often, this is going to be perhaps the preacher, the music director, maybe if you have a series team leader, which is a really great idea for any series. And that's going to be somebody who's kind of organizing the work. They're not doing all of the details, but they're organizing the details. They're organizing the folks who are bringing in the idea. So perhaps a series team leader has their finger on the pulse of all the ideas that have come in from the different, ritual artists. And so perhaps those three people are going to sit down. Maybe it's a different name for it. Maybe you have a worship chairperson or a worship team leader. It just depends on the makeup of your team. But the point is that it's a very small core group of people who are making these decisions. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't, once you make your first drafts, then bring a larger group of people together to look at them, to evaluate them. That's kind of an advanced step. If you have just started a team, that may not be a step that you do. But if you have a team, people have been working on worship for a long time, that may be a next step at the end of the script writing process, just to sort of run that by. But somebody's got to, sit down and start putting it in. That may be one person, right? Who then shares it with some other folks. So again, just depends on your team makeup, who you have working on it, what you imagine yourself doing. For me, I'll be honest with you, I make the first drafts on my own. I work collaboratively with all kinds of people to help give me ideas, but then I have to sit down, and I talk about in the book my creative process. I have to sit down and I close my eyes, and perhaps an idea for a theme song has been presented that really strikes me, and so I may even start listening to that. I often do, right? I'll put that. Maybe there's a YouTube video of it or a recording, and I'll put that on and I'll just listen to it, and I'll say, okay, what's happening in the space? What do I see? How is worship beginning? And by beginning, of course, I mean after welcome and announcements. And I talk about that in the book, but that threshold moment. And so I ask myself, how will we immerse ourselves in this series? What will invite us in to this experience that really steeps us right away, puts us in a certain place, perhaps? Maybe it's a sound effect. When I was putting together a series in the worship design studio called Discipleship by the Sea, they're all stories of Jesus at the Sea of Galilee. Well, where did I want people to go? I want them to go to the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. The shoreline was my anchor image. So the first thing that I thought of was what sound effect can help us be there? Waves lapping on the shore. So I'll go to iTunes, And I will search for waves lapping on the shore. And I'll find a sound effect, perhaps, that we might use. And I'll put that in the script. I'll put the link to the sound effect, or I'll download it and put it in one of our sticky notes, one of our brainstorm notes in the worship design studio. So that's the way that I begin that script writing process. I put myself there and I say, what's going to happen, right? And it probably, my love of this moment probably comes from my theater background, right? My first career was in theater and dance, many of you know. And I know what it feels like right before the curtain comes up. Oh my gosh, it's the best. It's that anticipation. And I'm talking about not just the folks in the seats, right? Because that's an amazing moment too, when the house lights go down and you're about to experience something. There is this anticipation that happens. And I want people to feel that in church as well. I want us to welcome each other. I want us to say, here's what's going on in the life of the church, because worship doesn't just happen on Sunday morning. It happens in everything that we do. I want to do the announcements. I want people to feel at home. And then I want something to happen. I want something to raise our anticipation, to make the hair on the back of our necks raise up, to lean us forward, and to invite us to go on a journey that's something different than our normal everyday lives, that's different from the agenda, the business meeting agenda. I don't want to just go through a checklist of things. I really have a problem with going from announcements and now let us stand for a call to worship. That does not make the hair on the back of my neck raise, right? So that's the question I put to myself. What can I do to help us enter the mystery, enter the presence? I mean, God is already there, so it's not like entering the presence of God, but in a more intentional way. So that's how I begin my script writing process. I put myself there and I say, how is it that we will begin this message? And it's a little bit mysterious. Intuition is something that I talk about in chapter 8 around the editing process. And it's something that editors also talk about, that there is certainly a technique to it. There's certainly things that they think of, that they keep in mind, that they learn very technical things about how you put the scenes together. But a big part of it is that intuition. And partly what they talk about in intuition is, what does it feel like? How do we move into it? As we're talking about the threshold moment here, the filmmakers talked about the first few minutes of the movie and how important that is and how much time they spend on that. Because that is the moment at which people either lean into it and they go on the ride with you, or they lean back and they're observers, right? And when you're in a leaned back observer kind of place, you're not as invested in it, right? And so, that first few minutes of the film, they want people to lean into it. They want to immerse them in the world of the story. And so I think in the script writing process, this is one of the most important moments of the entire enterprise. How do we get into it? And when I get a vision of what that threshold moment can be, then things begin to flow. Then I begin to see, what's next and what's next and what's next. Now, this is a very different process from putting your template of your bulletin in front of you and going, okay, what am I going to put in that slot? What am I going to put in that slot? What am I going to put in that slot? Completely different process or frame of mind, right, than that. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't have something that resembles an order of worship, right? Because we bring our creativity to a structure, and that is a really great thing, right? So I talk in the book about the order of worship. The order of worship really is a very ancient journey. And we're going to use this series, Can We Talk? A Lent series about honest conversations with Jesus as an example today. So let me just run through. I've got the script here on the slides. Let's just look at it from the meta-narrative first. Okay, so the meta-narrative, our Christian tradition, helps us with a fourfold pattern, right? And this is in chapter 8. I talk about the four movements, right? We gather. So you see that I have that big heading there at the beginning. We gather. Then on page 2, about 3/4 of the way down, we hear God's word. So we go into the proclaiming section of the service. Then on the 3rd page, you see I've got we respond to God's word, the response section. That's the 3rd movement of that ancient fourfold pattern. And then finally on the last page, we are sent forth into God's world. So that's that last and final movement. Now, let's go back to page 1. Those 4 titles are something that I always start with. I think it's so, it's such an elegant progression. It's something that is connected to us as human beings. It's what we do when we gather for anything. We get together, we connect with each other at a party. Hey, oh, so good to see you. So glad you could come, right? So, here's this, and the food's over there, and the drinks are the announcements, right? Orientation to, just a welcoming hospitality thing, right? And probably you have decorated the place, or given it some special touch if you're having a dinner party, something maybe specials on the table. Maybe there's music playing in the background, right? So all of these things is part of the gather. And the what's on the table, the visuals, the kind of music is going to set the tone for the whole thing, right? If it's a candlelit dinner and it's, nice sort of smooth jazz or whatever, that sets a very different tone than if you come in and it's bright and there's a lot of people and they're talking and the music is louder, which makes people talk louder, which raises the energy, right? So it's all the same kind of thing. And then we move into telling our stories, right? Maybe we gather around the table and we tell our stories and we connect with each other and we catch up with each other and we talk about hopefully what's important to us. We proclaim, right? We gather, we proclaim. And then, we respond to each other and we, there's things that we do. Oh my gosh, it's been so good to be with you. Let's do this. Let's get together or come with me to this or whatever. What is the response? What kind of response do we have to having been together? Something's going to happen because of this, whether that's just having reconnected and we're going to stay connected on Facebook or whatever. We respond in some way. And then we say our goodbyes and we go into the world. So it's just human nature. And I think it's such a wonderful structure, this fourfold pattern. Now, I talk in the book about some ways that differs from church to church. But I think no matter what style of worship that you're practicing, that fourfold pattern is such a great structure in which to create. So that I start with that, right? That is going to be, for me, that is the same every time. Now, I might call it different things based on the series, but that gives me my meta-narrative. And within those things, I'm going to be creative about how that happens. And that, although I'm creative within those things, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, what are we going to do during this series? How is this different than other messages, other series? And then I'm going to repeat that order actually throughout the entire series, whatever it is. So let's take a look at that here in this Can We Talk series. And basically what I'm giving you here is a roughed out outline. This would be kind of the first run through, the first sort of ideas. And actually, to be honest, this is something that I worked on. I just did a consultation with a church. And, they are at the first stages, like maybe you are, of how do we implement this process of design, because they've been doing one-hit wonders. They've been doing weekly planning, last minute, and they're at a point where it's not working for them anymore. Especially musicians are like, yeah, we want to have input. They have great musicians, but very frustrated ones at this point because they don't have a process that helps them have input into the process. And the music may or may not have anything to do with the message. So we were going through this. And so this is an example I gave them of what they're doing for their Lent series, of how they could put it together. So first Sunday in Lent. So I always start by doing the first Sunday of a series. And I sketch that out. Because as soon as I sketch that out, then I'm going to be able to take those threads and repeat them in all the other Sundays. So it's going to make it easier to get the whole series done at once. So you see, music for gathering, what I often call the prelude. And again, that's a very important decision, because that is going to set a tone as people come in the room. And that's the purpose of a prelude, is what is the tone that we're going to set. The liturgy of life I call welcome and announcements. And you'll see in this one, we have a little liturgical response after the announcements. We thank God for these opportunities for fellowship and service. Thanks be to God. And that was because they really liked this idea that I often have about announcements, and that is to sort of frame them a little bit liturgically, to say, there's a reason why we do these announcements. It's not just to get through them, but to actually remind us that worship is the fount out of which a lot of things happen in fellowship and service. And then you'll see the leader says, let us take a moment to tune our hearts to God. And there's what we call music for centering on God, a short instrumental voluntary, whether that's, whatever instrument, doesn't matter, but it's a short meditative voluntary. And one of the reasons to do this in this series is because we're talking about conversations and how important it is to be in conversation, not just with God, but with each other. And so the threshold moment is going to include us getting quiet and having a moment of just, right? Tuning our hearts to God. So it makes sense for this series. We might not do that for every series. Then the next thing is we enter the conversation. And so what I have here in the rubrics, which I have in italics, the choir sings from the back slowly with harmonies, with feeling. And the song is, open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Place in my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Now, this song was suggested by somebody on the worship team. And I love it because what it's saying is, open us to glimpses of truth that you have for us, God. That's a conversation, right? That's the first step in a conversation, is opening us to each other. And we have it from the choir in the back, which means that we're in this contemplative space, and we don't see them, we just hear them, so that we're able to focus on our connection with God and not our connection with the choir, right? So that's a choice. Everything is intentional. Then it says, musical underscoring continues as the pastor says the synopsis of the service from the front and center. And this was important in this church because they were doing everything from the pulpit and lectern. I mean, everything. And we wanted for the pastor in this next thing to have an open conversational stance rather than I'm reading from behind a pulpit. And so the next thing is the synopsis. And in your process of design, you've already written these synopses, right? And so this is one way that that work that you did weeks ago, maybe months ago at the retreat, comes in. On this first Sunday in Lent, we enter a spiritual journey over the next 6 weeks where we hear Jesus say, "Can we talk?" 6 stories of 6 conversations Jesus had with people who crossed his path will remind us that Jesus is still inviting us to conversations about things that matter deeply. This week, we follow him into the wilderness. And so in this silence, Let us quiet our hearts, open ourselves to what Jesus has to say, and the deep conversations that he is inviting us to have with each other. Now, in the rubric right before that, it said that the piano or the organ kept playing underneath, or the guitar, or whatever it is you're using, kept playing underneath. And what that does is it keeps us in the moment, right? It continues that contemplative feel. But at this point, the music fades out and we have just a little bit of silence. And what a great way to start every service in a Lent series, with a little bit of silence. Then out of the silence, the rubric says, as the acolytes go down the aisle, a voice begins and the choir joins. And as the Sundays progress, this could change. You could put these words in the worship guide so the congregation joins in as well. But still, it's slow and thoughtful, right? So out of the silence, we just hear a voice. Silently now I wait for thee. Choir joins in. Ready, my God, thy will to see. And then in subsequent weeks, the congregation is joining in, right? Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. Now, that whole bit is something that will repeat every Sunday, except for the synopsis will be different, right? That's the threshold moment. It's also what I call a layered sequence, which I talk about in the book. And a layered sequence is a way of thinking about how something happens, how it flows. Okay, so this is where flow comes in, my friends. As you're designing, you're going to think about not just what is in this slot, what is in this slot, what is in this slot, right? In this, we just had a little instrumental piece. We had silence, we had a song, and we had a synopsis. Now, we could have done those 4 things, boom, 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 all separate, with just like we do it and we stop. 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 That's the way worship often is, right? But instead, we're thinking of this as one piece, a layered sequence. And we're saying, how does this flow? How does it progress, right? So, boom, threshold moment. Then the organ segues into the opening hymn, right? So, Spirit divine comes to a close. Da-da-da-da-da-da, what, and if you're lucky enough to have an organist or a pianist that knows how to go from one key to the next, that might be happening, or you just come to a complete stop and then start with that intro to the opening hymn, and people stand and we go. All right, so I have sat at my computer, I've closed my eyes, I have imagined this moment. How do we come into conversation with God? And this is what came out. And it came out of things I already had, right? So I got a song, that was a song idea from somebody, and the synopsis had already been written, right? And so I just put it together. All right, so passing of the peace happens right after the opening hymn, and then we go into the next section. We hear God's word. Nancy just said, this looks like it could be a great template for an anytime series. Yes, exactly. I think so too. Change the synopsis, the scriptures, the thread songs. It could all port over all over the liturgical year. Can I steal this? Of course you can. Remember, Nancy, that's what I'm here to do. To resource you, give you ideas. So go for it. Okay, so then, I'm on to the next section, the next part, the second movement. We hear God's word. So this is the proclaim section. So I've got the children's time there. Then I go into the readings. Now, this is my second layered sequence. I almost always design and I think of every one of these 4 movements as a layered sequence, right? So I am going to think about readings for this series with a song woven throughout. And so I've got the song title next to the title readings, and it's going to be different every week, right? This is not going to be a thread song because we want the song to relate to the particular story of the conversation for that week. So I've just sketched this in, right? I'm going to do a song verse, or if it's just a refrain, I'm going to sing that, going to the next page. Then I'm thinking about some contemporary reading, or it could be a psalm, could be a contemporary poem, but that the first reading is maybe this church is following the lectionary for Lent, and that's where they're getting all of these stories. And so it could be the psalm reading for that Sunday, straight from the lectionary, right? And so that would happen. Then we would sing the next song verse or refrain. Now you see, I'm calling the scripture reading, the gospel lesson, which is what the preacher is going to be preaching on, the conversation, right? So I am, instead of saying scripture reading, I am thinking creatively about how can we name that section something that has to do with the series, right? So it's the conversation. This is the conversation that we're going to be talking about, right? And then the sermon, I'm going to call continuing the conversation. I have a lot of fun with that. I love doing that, sort of messing with those typical titles, right? It wakes us up. And it also steeps us into the series more. And then the word and song, the anthem, is in this series going to come right after the sermon. So all of that gets woven in. That's another layered sequence. I'm on to my third section. All right, prayers of the people. My rubrics say lower the light a bit for prayer during this season. All right, it's Lent. Let's do something different. And certainly in this space, they have the capability to do it. And I wanted them to play with that because it gives that section a different feel, right? So I also suggested have a box in the worship guide each week, maybe an insert with a question for people to spend a moment journaling about. And the leader could introduce it something like, this season we will contemplate a question inspired by the conversation story each week. You're invited to journal in our prayer time if you wish in the space provided in the worship guide. And then sometime this week, let it start a conversation with someone so that this Lent may be filled with room for deep and meaningful conversations. So basically what we're doing is we're creating a ritual action tied to the series, the message of the series. And those of you who have done my Reboot Your Worship, those of you who are in the worship design studio and are being trained in this, you know that this is something that I think is one of the most important pieces of thinking about congregational participation, and that is creating some sort of ritual action that you can repeat every week. In this one, it's just simply a time of journaling during the service, which then we connect to the invitation to have a conversation with someone about that outside of worship during the week. So what does that do? It deepens the message. It says, this series is about conversations, so let's have some deep conversations during the series, right? Outside of worship. So then the Cares Chorus is another song that was suggested by somebody on the team. Great. I cast all my cares upon you. I lay all my burdens down at your feet. Anytime I don't know what to do, I will cast all my cares upon you. It's a nice contemplative song. It's a refrain. It's easily learned. It'll be a thread song, right? And so having an extended instrumental introduction to this gives people time to write. And then maybe the choir sings it the first Sunday by themselves if the people don't know it yet. It surrounds the pastoral prayer and the Lord's Prayer, and then the people sing it. So it's a bookend, right? So there is my layered sequence related to section 3 of the movement. All right, then I go on with some ideas for the Great Thanksgiving for the 2 Sundays that have communion for this community, because they do it once a month. And what I do here is I sort of took the Sanctus. It's something that I love to do. Take the wording of the Sanctus, the Holy, Holy, Holy Lord, God of hosts, Hosanna in the highest, and I rework it into a song that is one of our theme songs. So in this one, I did it for the Cares Chorus, and that's a really fun thing to do. All right, we offer our gifts and ourselves, offering time, and then we're into the final sequence, a hymn of going into the world, benediction, and a sung response. Again, another idea. The Lord bless you and keep you, right? And so there's my sort of layered sequence for that ending. And really what I would do every week is when the hymn of going into the world, which is different every week, closes out, ends, I would do the benediction, and I would actually have the instrumentalist start to play an introduction to that sung response underneath. that benediction. So it creates this layered moment. Yay! Okay, so there's the anatomy of a design, a script writing process. And you see, it's really not super complicated. In fact, I tried to make it not complicated because it left more room for that contemplative nature of the Lent season or whenever you're doing this. Okay, so we've talked about script writing. Now I've got all these things down in the first Sunday, and basically that I just did was simply an outline of, and with all of the thread things in there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste that to all 6 of my Sundays. And then I'm going to go back and all those places where I had lines, fill in the blank. At some point, you do have to plug in things that are going to be different for every Sunday. And so I go back through my list of congregational songs that somebody has made me. I go back through some of the poetry if I'm deciding to do that. Maybe our verbal artists have found some poetry about conversation, and I go in and I decide which poem is going to work for which Sunday. And so things start to come together. Do you see how this works? So now I know what poems I'm going to do, what scriptures, what songs, and now I know what I need, right? So maybe what I decide is that we're going to have an insert in the worship guide that's going to be a piece of parchment paper that actually has that box for journaling on it. So I'm going to send somebody to get parchment paper, and we're going to print off the whatever's on it for every Sunday. We're going to get that done, right? Maybe what we have in the chancel area is maybe there's a table that has a feather pin on it, Not that we all write with feather pins, but what it evokes is that time of journaling. Or maybe there's 2 chairs on either side of the table evoking a conversation, right? So we're going to think visually, and we're going to get our visual artists going. So task management is the next piece, but we know exactly what we need because we have designed the entire kit and caboodle, right? So in the Worship Design Studio, those of you who are members know that we have a task manager that you can use in our design app. And a lot of people use our design app just solely for the brainstorming, for the sticky notes, for adding, it's a common place where everybody on your team is in your account, and you're just adding your ideas there so that when the script writing happens, I can just go in there, I can look at the list of all the ideas, and it's right there. And then also use it for the task management, because you can assign a task. It will automatically send emails to the people who've been assigned the task. They go back in, they mark it done, and it automatically sends you an email if you assign the task to let you know that it's done. So a lot of people are using the task manager in there as well. But some way of managing those tasks and getting those things done. In our design process, you have 3 weeks to do that. Hello, 3 weeks to do that, right? Let's go back to the process. Oh, here we go. So if we get our scripts done 4 weeks before the series begins, it means we have 3 weeks to get our tasks done and get all our ducks in a row before the series even begins. And that is such a great feeling. Oh my gosh, it's a great feeling, because guess what, preachers? You get to spend more time per week on your sermon and on those things that you need to be doing rather than deciding what you're going to do. Musicians already know weeks in advance what they're doing, or even the congregational songs that they're doing. So they can begin to rehearse the choir on those things and maybe they create some parts because they know that verse 3 would be amazing a cappella with parts, and they have time to do those creative things. Oh, awesome. Okay, so the tasks happen, and then the Q to Q rehearsal. So in the book, I go into detail about the Q to Q rehearsal, but also, those of you who are reading the book, I really want you to not miss out on the bonus materials. So when you go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com, scroll down a little bit, and there is a form to fill out with your name and your email address. And what that does is our system sends you an email that has links to a web page for every chapter. And there's so much more material on there. Amazing amount of material that you can see and read and worksheets and articles and videos and all kinds of things that can supplement this. This really can be a training ground, right? It's a training system to help you get more systematic about your production, which in turn creates more creativity, facilitates more creativity. So when you go to thinklikeafilmmaker.com and you get those links in for this chapter 8, that page is going to have this this whole article about tips for the Q to Q rehearsal. And let me show you real quick what's in there. There are questions for every one of the worship arts. As you walk through, and I suggest in the book that you do this, especially the week before your first Sunday of the series, it's going to take a little bit longer because you are working out this new threshold moment. You're working out how all these things are going to go. But you're going to think about, where are leaders sitting when the worship begins? Where do they lead from? When do we tell them to go, to their places? That's hugely about flow. The QDQ rehearsal is so much about flow, and it is the key. It's the key, my friends, to having worship feel like it's a journey from beginning to end and not herky-jerky kind of thing. Musicians, some questions about that. Do we have a backup plan if ritual actions take longer or shorter than expected? How do we make the transition smooth? Do we need to have some underscoring or some walking music for the choir to get forward, etc., etc.? Visuals. Do we have everything in place? Is anything in the way of any movement that we need? Do we have everything we need? Media, going through, if you're using projected images, going through in the Q to Q, going through all of the images, making sure everything is spelled right, everything is there that you need, that the transitions are right, which means you have to have your slides done before the Q to Q rehearsal, not on Saturday night. Oh my gosh. How many churches do I consult with where they are doing their slides for Sunday on Saturday night? And it's just crazy making. I'll just say it. It's too stressful. So here's the thing. If you have your scripts done a month before the series begins, one of those tasks can be creating working on it in one fell swoop or a couple of times. And here's the really great thing is that you're going to have in these thread items, these things that repeat. So it's not like reinventing the wheel all over again, right? You're going to take your slide presentation for this Sunday, you're going to make another file, you're going to copy that over, then you're going to change the songs that are different. It just doesn't take that long to do it in one concentrated period. And what we know from creativity experts about all of this is that if you concentrate your efforts, you do more of it in one sitting, then you will spend less time than if you just did it little by little. Because every time you do it little by little, you have to get your head back into it, right? And that takes twice as long. Where was that file? What are we doing? Oh, well, right? Okay. So ritual action, dramatic arts, do we have everything we need, especially on Communion Sundays, or if we're going to be doing different things? Do we have in the Can We Talk series, do we have writing utensils in all the pews so that if people don't have their own, they're not sitting there going, well, I'd love to be journaling, but I have nothing to write with, right? So just making sure that we have all of our little things taken care of. So that's what you can get by going to those bonus materials with the book. Of course, those of you who are part of the Worship Design Studio, that's in the Worship Design Studio as well. Okay, one last thing about worship guides, and then we're out of here. That is, friends, if you have a worship guide that has a picture of the church on the front, and that's what you have Sunday after Sunday, please, I beg of you, stop! We just came in the church. We know what it looks like. That is an important piece of real estate on your worship guide. Use it to further the message. Here is a picture of one of our Worship Design Studio member churches who just started, like many of our churches, are doing this Roll Down Justice series for Lent, a fully scripted series that I put together. And they really took advantage of that cover of that worship guide. As soon as people sit down and they look at it, they get immersed in the series because of that image. So that is as important a visual image as what's on your projections, what's on your table, what's on your walls. It is so very important. So let that be an inspirational kind of thing. I talk a lot about what should be in and not in worship guides in the book. And back to our question at the top of the hour, I don't think it's an either or. In the book, I really talk about the fact that if you have projected images and you can put words up there, that's terrific. But the truth is that some people like to have at least an order of worship. And you see how creative we were with the headings on that Can We Talk series. That helped us into the message even more. So seeing that, having that worship guide that offers us another way in, especially for verbal linguistic intelligences. It's really an important thing often for those folks, so that they can use that as a way to enter more deeply. Also, if you have a worship guide, you can literally, with the right licenses, right, reprint some music that you may be using that's not in your hymnal or your songbook in the pews. And if you're just using words on the screen, one of the things that, with new piece of music, if you don't have that music anywhere for your sight readers to read, you're going to get less singing. If you have, and I talk in here about, at the very least, even if you don't have any worship guide, you have everything on the screen, make some handouts just for, you'll get a sense of how many sight readers you have. Make some handouts of the music that people can pick up on their way in if they want to. You will get better singing if people who can read music are actually reading the music. And I say treat your congregation like a choir, and you'll get better singing. So that's one of the things that I talk about in the chapter around worship guides. And worship guides can be as artistic as anything else in the service. Okay, I see another question. Do you have a method or source for contemporary words like the psalm poem you mentioned here? So really what I do a lot of searches on the internet for poetry. There are a lot of sites where there is poetry that you can just type in a theme word, a keyword. It will bring up poems. A lot of people post their poetry. There's some really wonderful sites, and they give permission to use it, or you can contact them and say, I'd like to use this in a worship service. And I have never been turned down, actually. So it's pretty easy to do. You just do it. And so I often use quotes as well. So I think there's something called Quote Garden. There's a lot of quote sites that are wonderful for pulling quotes off. And my book, The Worship Workshop, came out almost 20 years ago now, has some worksheets in it for writing your own psalms. And I believe that I may have actually put those worksheets in the chapter, the bonus materials on the webpage in the chapter for the verbal arts. So check that out and see if that's on there. So writing your own psalms is a really wonderful way of bringing the theme out even more and actually having a writing group. So during this Can We Talk thing, how perfect would it be to have a journaling group or have a conversation, have small groups that converse, about those questions that we wrote down. That just furthers the theme in a small group way. Okay, that's worship guides. So friends, we did it. I'm a few minutes over, but thank you for sticking around. Thanks for joining me today. Those of you who are watching the recording, thanks so much for doing so. And again, I'm just so honored and privileged to be in conversation with you about Think Like a Filmmaker. And just a note, you can get this on Amazon.com if you don't have it already, but you can also order it at thinklikeafilmmaker.com, and we give a discount if you buy 3 or more, because we want to encourage you to use this as a study guide for training your team. So this plus the bonus materials that we give you, the web pages, is a whole training curriculum. All right, friends, thank you so much, and may you have a blessed day. Bye-bye.